My name is Bilal Orfali, Sheikh Zayed, Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies here at the American University of Beirut. This lecture is organized by the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages, the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies, and the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. Our distinguished speaker today is colleague and friend Justin Stearns, Dr. Justin Stearns. His title is Revealed Sciences, the Natural Sciences in 17th Century Morocco, and this is a book talk. It's a recently published book of his. Very quickly, Justin Stearns received his BA in English and History from Dartmouth College in 1998, and his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University in 2007. He is a professor of Arab Crossroads Studies at York University Abu Dhabi. His research interests focus on the intersection of law, science, and theology in pre-modern Muslim Middle East. His first book was a comparative intellectual history of Muslim and Christian understanding of Contagion, especially in the context of the plague, entitled Infectious Ideas, Contagion in Pre-Modern Islamic and Christian Thought in the Western Mediterranean, Hopkins University Press, 2011, and this book was recently translated and published in Arabic as well, for those who are interested. His book on the social status of the natural sciences in early modern Morocco, entitled Revealed Sciences, the Natural Sciences in Islam in Early Modern Morocco, Cambridge University Press, was published in 2021. It was also shortlisted for the Sheikh Zayed Book Award. And the first volume of his edition and translation of al-Yusi's al-Muhadarat Discourses appeared in the Library of Arabic Literature in 2020. This is in New York University Press. He is currently working on the second volume of the Discourses, al-Muhadarat, and together with a group of students is engaged in a long-term project to establish a searchable database of all catalogued Moroccan manuscripts. Something we're very much looking forward to. Extremely useful. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stearns to AIM.
Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see you all today and for you coming out and making time during this busy time of year. Thank you to Bilal Orfali for inviting me. It's been a wonderful pleasure to visit. This is my first time at AUB. I've been to Beirut before, but it's my first time here. Thank you to Aida Abbas for helping with the logistics. So let's see if we can have some fun. So what I'd like to do today is to talk about revealed sciences, religion, science, and the occult in early modern Morocco, as you can see. But the basic question here is, how do we write the history of the natural sciences in the Muslim world during the pre-modern period? And I'm going to start to divide this up into three parts. I'm going to start first with the argument, and I'll begin the argument with the biographies of three different scholars, just to get right into the details. So here we are. This is a fellow who's Nisbaz al-Meriti. You can see he lived his life between different centers of learning. There's Marrakesh, there's Merit, which is kind of a small village that's south of Agadir. There's Taroudant, Fez, and back to Marrakesh at the end. And he, during his life, he wrote on astronomy, he wrote on alchemy, he wrote on lettrism, that is to say the power of letters to be invoked with the proper intention in order to affect the natural world. And he wrote perhaps the only treatise against sorcery that I'm aware of at this time period, which is very interesting because it kind of breaks down what the difference is between when you can use letters and when you cannot use letters to invoke and what kind of powers you can invoke. The second figure is al-Hassan al-Yusi, who will figure, as Bilal mentioned. I've been translating al-Yusi. I've been spending a lot of time with him. He's been on my mind, and he figures in the theoretical framing for what I'm going to talk to you about today, specifically in the terms of what types of sciences are revealed, or shara'i. We can talk about my translation of shara'i. There's a number of different ways to translate the word, but that's how I've gone with it here. And you can see he was born outside of Sefrou, went south to Tamgrut, and I've got a map, don't worry. Marrakesh, Dila, Fez, Tetouan, Mecca, and then after doing the Hajj, came back and passed away near Sefrou again. And he wrote on logic, epistemology, theology, literature, and it's his sort of division of the sciences as ihsa al-ulum kind of in this treatise that gave me in many ways the impetus for writing this book. The third figure whom I'm going to bring in, who we'll see only marginally here in this talk, is Asalhi Dara'i. who was from Laktawa in Tamgrut. This is a small oasis I'll come back to that's on the northern edge of the Sahara. Spent his time there, Sijin Masa and in Fez, and wrote on medicine, astronomy, and lettrism. Now, a few things right off the bat. What you will notice in terms of their biographies is that they did not only frequent what we would call the classic centers of Islamic learning in Morocco. This would be Fez, Marrakesh. That's the places everybody's heard of. But one of the main points or interventions the book is trying to make is that we have to also look at to the rural. Historians of Islam and of the Islamic world have often focused on the urban as the site of production of knowledge, and we've often looked to the rural areas as either marginal, backwards, or not engaging in scholarly production that then influences the urban. And one of the things that I found for the 17th century in Morocco, and this builds on other scholars who've also been working on other oases in Algeria and so forth, and Tuat, is that actually some of the most influential scholars of this time period were not working in the urban centers. They were working in rural areas, and they were not working in what we might call the madrasa madaris system, but they were working in the zawiya zawaya. They were working in Sufi places and Sufi orders, and we find here Sufi orders and Sufi lodges as the primary sponsors of Islamic knowledge, not just in terms of what you might expect, the kind of dala'il al-khairat of Juzuli at this time period, which is becoming very popular in Morocco before it takes over the world, but also in the study of the natural sciences itself, right? So just keep that in mind. And here, for those of you who have not been to Morocco recently, I'll situate you geographically, okay? So we started off with Meriti, follow the little blue arrows as we go from Marrakesh down to Merit, then over to Taroudant, which is founded at this time period in the 16th century by the Saadi dynasty and becomes one of the three great centers of learning before today kind of receding into a sleepy second-order city, which is no longer a center of much at this point in Morocco. Then he traveled to Fez before making his way to Dilet. And now watch Dilet. Dilet is of primary importance here. For roughly, and I'll come back to this, for roughly 30 years in the 17th century, the largest part of Morocco is ruled out of Dilet. You've never heard of Dilet because the Alawites, when they came to power about 15 years later, razed it to the ground, took all of its scholars with them to Fez, but for a while there we had an Amazigh Zawiya in the Middle Atlas, which was ruling and controlling Morocco politically and intellectually. And that's the context in many ways that my book looks at. Now, he then makes his way back to Marrakesh after having taught sort of both the natural and the occult sciences at Dilet for much of his life. The second scholar I put up there was al-Yusi. So here's Sefrou, right south of Fez. He then studies in the classic places, goes to Marrakesh, goes down to Taroudant, but then we start watching him now, goes to the oasis city of Sijin Masa, which is also the ancestral homeland of both the Saadi and now the current dynasty of Morocco, the Alawite dynasty, makes his way down to Tamgrut, which now looks very marginal here on the map, right? But at this time period, when West Africa was united by the trade in gold and in slaves, Tamgrut was right on the heart of one of the most important sort of trajectories that you could use. And if you go to Tamgrut today, you'll find a sign saying 40 days to Timbuktu. And I was so delighted in 2008 when I was in Timbuktu, when I got to the northern part of Timbuktu, and I found a sign saying 40 days to Tamgrut. So there's an actual awareness on both sides of these 40 days. We've lost that now. Today it's a sleepy sort of backwards town at the edge where tourists go to go off into the desert. But at this time period, it was on one of the most central and dynamic sort of trading corridors of the time period. There is a book to be written actually about the link between Zawaya and the Sufi, and the slave trade and the gold trade in Morocco at this time period. That isn't yet to be written. He then makes his way to Dilet, where he studies with al-Meriti for about 20 years and writes almost all of his major works. Makes his way as far north as Tetouan, back to Marrakesh, off on Hajj, where he goes all the way to the Hijaz. He doesn't actually have any interest in any of the Mashriqi scholars. He's totally self-sufficient before he returns and passes away. The third scholar was As-Salahi Dara'i. He's born and works initially south here in Tamgrut, makes his way north to Fez before returning to Sijin Masa and back to Tamgrut. And my point here with linking these central urban areas and these rural areas is to show how for these scholars the rural areas were equally as important to the urban ones when it came to the study. If you're talab al-ilm, you're going to go both to the Zawaya as well as to the centers. And for some people, you'll just go to the Zawaya. You won't go to any of the major centers. Now, I know that you're all impatient to figure out what the point of the talk is. You've been waiting. It's been about 5 minutes, so here we are. The main things that I'm trying to claim here, first of all, is that the natural sciences remained important during this time period, okay? Just stick with that sense of importance. That is to say that they were studied, they were practiced, people wrote books in them. I found a total of about 120 works, more broadly speaking, in the natural and rational sciences that were written, produced in the long 17th century in Morocco, and which are extant, of which we have manuscript copies. Obviously, that would mean we would assume that there were even more that were written at the time period, some of which would be lost. By the paradigms that we have today, and I'll return to this point in my conclusion, there are not a huge number of advances. If you're looking for some kind of new breakthrough, a new Copernicus, you're not going to find it here. That's not what was going on. These sciences were studied and transmitted and were socially important without ever having given rise to the kinds of insights or developments which would be visible or legible to our modern audience for the most part. Not only were they studied, but in many ways they were integral to the Islamic practice. So another intervention I'm trying to make here is to say that the artificial distinction that we've often made when we write the history of the natural sciences in the Muslim world, between the classics, right? You have al-ulum al-aqliya wa al-ulum al-naqliya. You have the ulum al-awa'il compared to the ulum al-islamiyya. Those differentiations they're not productive for the material that I'm looking at, because in many cases the natural sciences are invoked in order to practice the religious sciences. And as we'll see with al-Yusi, he blows up these distinctions on an epistemological level completely. So they're not really relevant, which I think is also of interest because it complicates things. The other issue is that if we're really going to take what anthropologists might call emic categories, or categories that people themselves used, then we have to embrace the occult. We have to take the occult alongside. That is to say, alchemy, lettrism, astrology. These were all practiced at the same time period by scholars in 17th century Morocco, and they were considered to be equally valid as natural sciences. And I will kind of introduce lots more magical squares and lettrism in order to make that point and to convince you that for people of that time period, they were conceived of equally as rational, in terms using a modern term. What we are left with then, ultimately, is the possibility that you could have an alternative development or shifting or valuation of the natural sciences, which is perhaps not legible by our current paradigm, invoking that all too overused word of Thomas Kuhn's, but which were very relevant to the paradigm of the people who were living then. And then and this is Kuhn, for those of you who don't remember, posited a kind of a development of science that he mapped onto Darwin's tree of life. It starts in one place and then it branches off into many different directions. It's not a linear graph. It doesn't move progressively from less to more. It develops outward, and not all of the different pathways, the branches that you can matter, are intelligible to each other. They're working within different paradigms, and was what some people felt was really kind of controversial about Kuhn, none of them really progress towards a more optimal form of truth, right? Because you can only define truth within a paradigm. That was Kuhn's argument. I'm not going all in on Kuhn in this book, but I do find it useful to think about the possibility of natural sciences being embraced, studied, replicated within society, and moved in through generations without them following the same kind of graph that we have used when we teleologically look back and try to use the past in order to get to the present. So that is something I'm setting aside here in favor of trying to accentuate the contemporary categories. Okay. So what are we talking about when we look for the natural sciences? Where do we find them? And those of you who, like me, were trained as textualists, or what we might call in the olden days Orientalists, we're positivists. We want to know where the stuff is, right? That's what it comes. So here's the book. Before I get into the book itself, a little bit on the background. So I'm proceeding on the basis here that people have not recently studied a lot of 17th century Moroccan political history, so just a brief reminder. Morocco, its political dynasties can be broken into essentially an early period of a Sharifian Shia and Ibadi caliphates in the early period, followed by a sequence of Amazigh. So we used to call them Berber dynasties. But by the 16th century, we find our first Sharifian dynasty. That is a dynasty which links itself back to the Prophet Muhammad, which emerges from the south, from Sijil Masa. This is the Saadi dynasty, and it rules over from Morocco from roughly, say, 1550 till about 1603. So we're talking about 3 generations here at that time point, before its sort of most famous and influential ruler, Ahmed al-Mansur, passes away due to the plague in 1603. Now, before he had died, he had done a couple of really interesting things. He turned Morocco into an imperial power. He invaded West Africa, linked Timbuktu and what we would today call Mali to Morocco. He corresponded with Queen Elizabeth and even perhaps suggested a common conquest of the New World. He was a man with great ambition, and he passed away in 1603. Something else that in between 1603 and his death, Morocco splinters, and it takes about 60, 70 years for another Sharifian dynasty to emerge, to unite Morocco, and that is the same dynasty that continues to rule Morocco today. That is the Alawite dynasty, which considers itself quite old because it goes back to the 17th century in that regard. When we link this up to the intellectual context, we find that for the purposes of our discussion today, the Saadis are fascinating. Why? They found madaris, and they found zawaya, and they take what an earlier dynasty, which in the 14th century had come in, and the Marinids, and built madrasas in different Moroccan cities, they restore them. And they empower. So they're really developing an entire infrastructure of knowledge, which is important because once they collapse politically, the infrastructure remains. And it's an infrastructure which is not just urban, but is also rural. And so they set the basis for a broader literacy in rural areas in Morocco. And they also kind of, on a religious level, for those of you who are interested, set in motion the kind of triumvirate of knowledge, which is what we look at when we see Moroccan, the religious spectrum today. We see a Maliki school of law, we see an Ashari school of theology, and we see a Shadhili or Jazuli mixture of Sufism as the dominant form of Sufism. And that comes out from this time period. It's in that network, then, that we find the natural sciences being studied and transmitted. It's not apart from the religious sciences, it's alongside it at that time period. Also, at this time period, we find large quantities of books, not just, again, in urban areas, but in rural areas. For research on this project, I went to, for example, the Hamsiya Ayashia Zawiya, which is in the High Atlas, in a very remote rural area today, which was founded in the 17th century. But there you can still find roughly 10,000 manuscripts, which were collected, brought there, and were studied. And so we find that these rural areas, it has yet to be incorporated into Wizarat al-Awqaf, but I'm sure that the works will find themselves to the Royal Library at some point. But they're still there now, and they speak to the presence of this decentered landscape of learning at this time period. So again, just to kind of put this out there, these are rural centers of learning. I'm not going to talk about Elir much today, but the two Tamgrut and Dila, they're important. And we have here the Zawiya I was just talking about, the lodge, the Hamsiya Ayashia Lodge is right there. It's quite remote, but it's still administered by its descendants of its original founder today. Today they're goat herders, and they don't fully appreciate, I think, the entire intellectual legacy that they are still guarding, but it's still there, and it speaks to kind of a memory of a different moment in Moroccan history. And then, of course, we have the classic urban centers here. So this gives you, I think, a sense of what I'm talking about in terms of a landscape of learning, and a dispersed landscape of learning where you could study the natural sciences, not just in the major centers, the urban centers, but also in these rural areas. Just an aside, before I get into categories in sciences, al-Yusi, whom we'll come to in a moment, it's interesting. This is more from a literary perspective. He himself was Amazigh. He comes from al-Yusi. It's a particular branch, a tribe. It's probably, that has been there for a good amount of time, shall we say, in the Middle Atlas. But he was so Arabized, and many of his Amazigh colleagues were so Arabized that they struggled in some ways to connect to their own sort of ethnic background. And this is a short passage from his Discourses that I still find striking, because he's talking about genealogy, and he's saying, the Arabs, they really know their genealogy, and they're really amazing. And he says, wait a second, I guess I should go and talk to my own family. And then I used to think it was just the Arabs, but then he goes and he talks and he says here, I would say the Amazigh, and he uses the word Ajam here, which is interesting. In North Africa, Ajam carries it, instead of referring to Persian, he refers to the local indigenous people, are like goats. There is no bond between mother and son other than his being looked after and then going his own way. As for the father, no one even asks after him. This sounds like a slander that somebody else would say about them, but he's saying this about himself. When I asked my country folk about this, I found the matter to be different from what I understood. I discovered that they remembered their lineage as I have described previously, with genealogists ascertaining the branches and groups in the fashion of the Arabs. So this gives you also a sense of the complexity of the environment. This is one where the majority of the population of Morocco do not identify or understand themselves as Arabs. They come from a variety of Amazigh tribes, but they are using Arabic as the language of scholarship to make claims that will spread as far as the Mashriq and beyond. What do we know when we say about categorizing the sciences? I erased the binaries about sort of the alum al-aqliya and naqliya and stuff like that. Well, we find that writing books categorizing the sciences in which you're able to make these kinds of epistemological claims was not perhaps common, but we have a number of very influential examples at this time. The first we have al-Qanun, al-Yusi's own work, which has been luckily his work has now been edited and published in the last 20 years or so. We have Abdurrahman al-Fazi's Uqnum in the middle, which is a long poem enumerating the sciences. And then we have Turambati, who wrote at the end of the 18th century, and who basically, and this is relevant for my argument, takes up al-Yusi's basic categorization and moves them forward. And so this is striking because we want to see how the sciences are categorized. Al-Yusi does, in this passage, something which I have not seen anybody else do, and I ask for the wisdom of the audience if you have, which is to say, he says, what do we actually mean when we say that something is shara'i? What do we mean by this? He says, look, if I mean what is revealed, if it's revealed, then everything that the community uses and knows, that is shara'i. Everything that is useful to the Muslim community is shara'i. And you must be thinking at this point, but wait a second, aren't we going to try to differentiate between, say, fiqh, like Islamic jurisprudence, and falsafa? I mean, isn't that the whole purpose of all of our classic compartmentalizations and sort of numbering of knowledge, that we differentiate between what comes from Muslim sources and what comes from non-Muslim sources? And the UC has no time for you. No time for that at all. He moves straight forward. He says, look, if this is what you're thinking, then theology, ilm al-kalam, is not shara'i. Fiqh, outside of things like inheritance, is not shara'i. It's not in the Quran. Where does it come from? It comes from the engagement of the Muslim community with revelation. Okay? And so his main foe here, interestingly enough, is Suyuti. Now, Suyuti is a giant, and probably the Muslim polymath who wrote the largest number of works, as I'm sure you all know of him, 16th century, 1505, he passes away in Egypt. He is not someone to be trifled with. He's one of those scholars, but al-Yusi has no problem. He's like, no, he is stupid. He says al-Suyuti is utterly wrong. Al-Suyuti denies logic. He says logic is dangerous. Logic is a gateway drug. You use logic, and soon you may be doing philosophy. Dangerous. And al-Yusi's like, no. Absolutely not. Without logic, there is no fiqh. Without logic, there is no kalam. You cannot do this, right? And so he brings in here and he says, if it benefits the Muslim community, it is revealed. Now, this is the kind of instrumentalist argument in many ways, which is unusual, highly unusual. I haven't found anybody else who makes this. But al-Yusi makes it, and it's taken up by Turambati later. So if you're in this allows us then to have a whole different understanding and why the book is entitled, in fact, Revealed Sciences. Because it then means that astronomy, but not just astronomy, lettrism, alchemy, these are revealed sciences. These are sciences that come from God, right? They're not, there's no, where else would they come from? I mean, ultimately, when you're thinking about it. Okay, so let's take a look. So we have somebody like al-Yusi making this broad argument, nobody attacking him about it, and many people agreeing with him. But now you're like, well, but I'm a sociologist. I want to know how many people actually practice the natural sciences. Give me numbers. Whenever I talk to my social scientist colleagues, they're like, that's nice, but what's the data? Where are the numbers? Well, it just so happens, as those of you who study pre-modern Islamic intellectual history know, that we get numbers. Every time I go to my Europeanist colleagues, they have no clue what I'm talking about. But I'm saying, look, we have the tabaqat literature. We have literature. We can go through each generation, and we can look at what people studied. So we have about 9 different works of tabaqat literature from Morocco for the 17th century, and we can go through them, and we can do a numerical overview and see how many people who are registered in these different sources actually study the natural and the rational sciences. Now, it's not a huge amount. It comes out to about 9 or 10%, but la bes, I mean, that's not bad. That means that there's 9 or 10% of anybody who is literate and is studying in a center of learning has studied one or more of the rational and the natural sciences. We also have a different genre, which is particular to the Maghreb during this time period, and that's the fahrasa. Now, the fahrasa is, of course, more broadly spread throughout the Islamic world, but it takes on a specific form in Morocco in the 16th and 17th century. So that it's not just anymore a list of, these are my teachers, these are the books I studied, and so forth. Now it becomes an entire sort of Lebenslauf. I mean, it's an entire description of your intellectual history and your interests, which can run to 500 pages, and Meriti's Fahrasa runs to 1,200 pages in its printed form, which is a far cry from the earlier Faharis that are like just 2 or 3 pages long. We find, for example, in one of these, and Tamarnarti, who was from the south, from Tarantant, his Fahrasa, an example of another scholar, Bouakili, who in the late 16th century, in Tarantant, in the minarets, put in basically sundials specified to that geographic location in order to help people ascertain the times of prayer. Right? So this is quite striking. It shows us that in the person's account of their course of study, you would have other examples in which the natural sciences come in, and this would be kind of an example of what we might call the traditional sort of handmaiden. That is to say, science in service of Islam, as David King would say. That's what's going on in this particular case, right? But you also find other examples, and here's our first real encounter with the occult. From Meriti's Fahrasa, he's like, okay, well, if you're going to suffer a problem, for example, you don't want to get pregnant, then go and take this talisman, take these letters, write it on an amulet, and when a woman puts it on, then she won't get pregnant. This is today, and the reason I think I have to put this forward so forcefully, we have an inbuilt modernist desire to write this off as wrong, as false, as occult, as pseudoscience. But it's important here that within this context for the scholars, Meriti, who is also famed for writing a very important and widespread astronomical work at this time period, is able to place that right next to medical recipes, which he has in his Fahrasa, and next to his work on fiqh and other things. It is part and parcel of what is considered to be rational and reputable knowledge, right? So, in the same, on Umayri's slightly later 18th century Fahrasa, you have this phenomenal example of somebody putting into his Fahrasa a table where you can cross-reference the day in which you're in and the sign that you perceive, say a dog barking late at night. And you can use the day and the sign to then determine what that omen means at that point in time. So these things are written in and are considered, and I think this is, again, are considered to be valid. And this goes along with the kind of the image I used at the beginning, and I'll come back to Meriti's treatise against magic, which he wrote at that time period. So, for my second point then, if the first one was to say, here we have a certain percentage of people who we have an epistemological justification of the natural sciences being revealed. If my second point was essentially that here we see that there was a percentage of the scholars of the time period who studied the natural sciences and that they incorporated it in their own intellectual autobiographies. The third point that I want to make here is that the sciences were brought into and were constitutive of fiqh. For a long time period, people in my profession and sort of the history of intellectual historians privileged fiqh. We talk a lot about Islamic law when we talk about it. And this was perhaps a mistake on our part, and there are good reasons why other religious discourses such as kalam and tasawwuf have equal validity when it comes to speaking for religious practice. But still, fiqh is useful, especially when it comes to fatawa. Fatawa are fun because they give little glimpses into how sciences are being used in day-to-day situations. And so we find we have some sort of what we might call Greatest hits fatwa collections, that would be Al-Mi'yar of Wan Sharisi from the 16th century, collects all these really influential fatwa. It's like 13 volumes from the 11th century to the 16th century from the Maghreb. And then in Wazani in the 20th century writes Al-Mi'yar Jadid and picks up and gives us another sort of 4 fat volumes of fatwa that are greatest hits from the 16th to the 20th, meaning we have 1,000 years of influential legal opinions, and we can use that with great patience to go through and try to find examples of how the natural sciences are brought into and become constitutive of fiqh during these time periods, right? I'm just going to give you one example here because there are many. In some cases, they're simply brought in and you're like, okay, the classic example would be that a midwife would be a person who has medical knowledge on the status of women and that her testimony in a course of law is considered to be authoritative, right? Another one, which I'm sure is close to your minds, at least towards the beginning of Ramadan, would be, well, can we use calculations to calculate the beginning of Ramadan or not? This is not a new debate. This debate has been going on for a long time. One example, which I always found fascinating, was do we have to trust the testimony of doctors in cases of epidemic disease? Again, in the age of COVID, this may be on our minds. But these questions would come up in the legal manuals. But what I want to talk about as one example is something we call the Great Tobacco Debate. So the 17th century was when smoking hit its first high. No pun intended. This was when tobacco had arrived in the Muslim world in the late 16th century. And throughout the 17th century, a debate raged across the Muslim Mediterranean between scholars in Egypt and Morocco, West Africa, down to Yemen, through the Levant, with people taking opinions pro and against smoking. And of course, we have states, the Ottoman Empire, the Moroccan monarchy, trying to clamp down and to control the use of tobacco, and as you might expect, failing completely because people want to smoke. This remains with us today. What's interesting here, I'm not so interested in the debate. The debate is cool. It's a lot of fun. James Grehan has written about it very nicely. Other people have written about it very nicely. But what is interesting to me is how in that debate, medicine and the body became centralized. You cannot be doing fiqh now without a knowledge of the body. And the body is pulled into your legal discourse. Now you have to have an opinion. Al-Qarafi back in the 13th century had a minority opinion, I admit it, argued that the smoking of hashish is halal and that you can smoke hashish because it does not have the same effects as khamr. It does not intoxicate, right? Well, believe it or not, his was a minority opinion, and most people went with the notion that smoking hashish is haram. But now we have tobacco. It's a new drug. Is it allowed? Is it not? Why? What is the illah? What is the legislative cause behind what it's able to do? In order to answer that, and I give you here an extract of a Moroccan jurist who came down defending smoking, you have to be able to make a claim about the effects of tobacco on the body. And while there were some scholars who felt that tobacco was harmful to the health, on what basis? There were other scholars who felt that it was excellent for the health and that smoking a little bit reinvigorated you, it opened the lungs, you might even cast out flies, so all these examples of people expelling insects from their mouths after smoking and just getting rid of all the bad things inside you. But the broader point here, regardless of your feelings about tobacco, is that you couldn't do fiqh without medicine. You couldn't do law without having a basic understanding of the natural sciences. And you can make similar claims, of course, with when it comes to times of prayer and Ramadan and so forth. What happens when we go then to the sciences themselves? What were people writing when it comes down to the sciences? I have here Meritis on the far left, his treatise on alchemy. It's a short treatise on alchemy. Here we have Rodani's tables. He develops a series of tables of locations for Morocco when he takes. And then we have al-Salahi's massive commentary on his own poem, a medical poem, which is preserved in the National Library. But before that, I think we all can just enjoy this. So Al-Rodani was a very interesting guy. He comes from the Middle Atlas. He studies in Morocco. He ends up doing Hajj, goes to Mecca and Medina. He settles there. He's written works on astrolabe, which has been translated by Sheikh like 60 years ago. But when he settles down and kind of devotes himself to a life of spirituality and retreat, he also makes a living by selling these papier-mâché orbs. I mean, in many ways, they're celestial, they're not even celestial globes. It's hard to know what to describe them as fully. This is an interesting example that David King pointed me to that we actually have. This was sold at Christie's, as you can see, in 2015 for a substantial amount of money. It has his own signature on it, which shows that some of these objects actually were able to survive. And it bespeaks a certain ability on his part, but also a certain interest that these were commodities that people wanted to possess. How useful it would actually be to calculate places, I don't know. I haven't seen anybody who's actually had an opportunity to hold this and to look at it as it's disappeared into private collections at this point. When we come to Al-Meriti on alchemy, his writings on alchemy are pretty much just straight up the standard. For those of you who've never encountered an alchemical work, the first thing you have to convince somebody when they buy or read an alchemical work of yours is that they are now in on the secret. You have knowledge. This is classic occult stuff. It's occult knowledge. They are lucky that they are getting to hear it from you, and you are now going to reveal the secrets to that person. And the most frustrating thing, of course, when you're reading these texts is that then it goes on to be completely incomprehensible for the next 5 pages. And so either you realize that you yourself do not have access to the knowledge, or you do not know the words, what we might call the Decknamen, as they say in German, the specific terms, as we would have here. Say, for example, like the term feed your eagle, right? The eagle is ammonia. And he explains some of these terms, but he leaves a lot of the other ones kind of unclear. So we're looking at really an occult form. But along with alchemy, we also have magic. And it's interesting to pause for a moment on magic. Al-Yusi spends some time talking about magic. And he talks about magic as something that has been passed down through all the peoples before the Arabs and before Islam in different ways. And the difference between magic and between lettrism is one of who you invoke, right? I mean, if anybody invokes one of the 99 names of God or uses the letters which compose part of, say, the Basmala or something else, or you invoke one of the archangels, this is not magic. Magic is when you invoke a jinn or a shaitan. It has to do with intention. Who are you turning to? Right? And al-Yusi believes that magic exists. And you should, in fact, study it, if only to know how to stop it. Right? So it's important that it exists. And you cannot practice it. It's clearly you cannot practice it because it involves invoking agents other than God. But in many ways, structurally speaking, it has parallels to the other types of occult arts which are being practiced at the time period, right? The belief that letters can actually invoke the natural world, that there is a sense of a sympathetic magic in many ways if you are of the correct intention. Going back to the classic al-amal biniyat, right? That your actions are according to your intentions. The initial slide I had for my talk went back to Riti's treatise against sorcery. Here are 3 examples of that treatise. That treatise is now both found in chat rooms in Morocco where people are interested in the occult. That's the example on the far left. It's a 20th century copy. It is found in manuscripts from the 17th and 18th century kept in Tetouan, and it is found in Ségou in West Africa. Right, so this treatise against sorcery was successful. It had legs. It was copied, and so forth. So, I hope by now to have convinced you of a few things. There was study of the natural sciences in the 17th century in Morocco. It was not incidental. It was important. It happened in rural areas as it did in urban areas. It encompassed the occult sciences as it did other sciences that we might be more easily prone to accept as natural sciences today. What do we make of that? What story do we tell? Let's just recap. What master narratives have there been in recent years on how we tell the story of the natural sciences in the Muslim world? Well, we have our friend Toby Huff, the writer of Early Modern Science, with one of our esteemed guests, Professor Saliba, has had an interesting exchange a number of years ago. Huff is a good example of what we might call the marginalization thesis. That is to say that the natural sciences were practiced in the Muslim world to a certain point, and then they were marginalized and not studied ever thereafter. Huff is our easy in some ways, we can put him up as a straw man to put him down, because nobody in the field really believes in Huff anymore, but actually his argument still has legs outside of the field, where people still feel, in fact, we've just seen this recently, I've seen this is on shows like Cosmos, as it comes out again now, and so forth. The idea that after al-Ghazali or after the fall of Baghdad, rational thought in the Muslim world ended, is unfortunately still has credence out there in the world, if not in the academy itself. There is a kind of a mirror through the looking glass counter-narrative, which is that of 1001 Inventions, which was put together by a group it's a Muslim British organization that really wanted to push back against Islamophobia, and in order to do that in England, it put together a series of ways in which Muslim contributions to world science could be emphasized and held up as paradigmatic. And if you haven't seen the trailer on YouTube, you really should see it, because it is a marvel of Harry Potterdom. It is great. It has Ben Kingsley plays a prominent Muslim scientist. And it goes kind of way too far in the other direction. It argues that the iPhone is the product of Ibn al-Haytham. It argues that the plane is the product of early sort of yes, Furness. It argues, so everything that you have, you draw back to somebody usually who lived between the 9th and the 12th century. What both Toby Huff and 1001 Intervention share, however, is that following the 13th century, more or less, things kind of go dark. The Muslim world stays in this kind of uninteresting wasteland until colonialism and the 19th century. Right? Where do we get this narrative from? If you go to the second line here, you'll see that we have Muhammad Abduh, one of the great reformers of the 19th century, and we also have Ignaz Goldziher, who is perhaps one of the most influential early European Orientalists of the 20th century. What Goldziher and Abduh shared was that there had been what Goldziher would call an finsteren orthodoxy, a dark orthodoxy that had reigned over the Muslim world after this time period. It was a decline. The decline narrative then emerges out of what? For Abduh, the decline narrative is great. If something has declined, well, now we have to wake it back up again. How do you justify strong reform? Well, you have to have had a decline in order to justify reform. Otherwise, everything's going great. Why have reform? For Goldziher was looking at and talking to reformers, and other people picked this up. And so they're writing at the same time period that an American like Andrew Dixon White is writing his great opus on the battle between science and religion. The notion that science and religion are somehow inimical to each other. And so we then begin to get in the 20th century, in the 19th and the 20th century, both the understanding, both in Europe and in the Muslim world, that there had been a decline. The decline had started way back when, in the 12th, 13th century, and that in order to get back away from that, you had to go back to that time period. Now, that's a broad subject, and I'm not going to go into detail. What I'm interested in here is the effect on our understanding of the history of science in the Muslim world. And the effect on the history of science is that we become much less interested in anything that gets produced after the 13th century. We don't even go looking for it. And it just so happens that my book is smack dab in that time period. It's the 17th century, it's Morocco. And my argument then is that the previous theses based on the decline narrative either have been marginalization, that was the Huff argument, that the natural sciences got marginalized and were not studied anymore. Then there's the classic Ayah Sabra argument, which was really influential and which kind of took us a whole way step forward. This is about 40 years ago. And he argued that, look, actually what happened is that Muslims appropriated aspects of the natural sciences and naturalized them to help with the religious sciences. And you'll recognize this from what I was talking about in terms of astronomical ability to foretell prayer times in the beginning of Ramadan, and also, of course, medicine and the Great Tobacco Debate and so forth. But this only really works if you continue to maintain a binary between religious and non-religious or rational sciences. Ahmed Dalal whom you may know, came back a little bit later on and wrote a book in which he argued for the compartmentalization. He said, no, Sabra did not get it entirely right. It's more that the sciences and religion have different epistemological spheres, and that they do what they do in those spheres, and that's what happened in the West was that science's sphere overtook the religious sphere and dominated all of it, and that's how the West went on to have this kind of secular technological modernity. I am not happy with any of these. I think that there are aspects of all of them which are helpful and true, but overall they do not reflect what I am seeing in the 17th century in Morocco. And the basic point I'm trying to make in this book is that instead of making these broad theses, we need to go forward into working from the ground up. We need to become more positivistic in the sense that we have to admit a certain kind of epistemological humility. We don't actually know what people were doing. We have been distorted by these master narratives which have led us to look for only certain kinds of evidence. When we look at the new trends today, we have works like the amazing intellectual history done by Khaled al-Ruayheb in his work on 17th century intellectual history, which does not touch upon the natural sciences, but does talk about the importance of someone like al-Hasan al-Yusi when it comes to logic. Right? Al-Yusi was huge in logic, and his Moroccan scholarship influenced and drove what was happening in Egypt during the 17th century. So we see here the ability, the fact that there was ongoing intellectual creation and creativity during the early modern period. We have with Sonia Brentes somebody who has decided that when we ask questions about the natural sciences, we have to ask questions not just about the great men and the works they produced. That is vital and important, and we are grateful to the scholars who have done that. But we also want to look at how they were studied and how that knowledge was transmitted through institutions. And obviously, in my discussion of the Zawaya and the Madaris, I have drawn a great deal on Sonia's work when it comes to that. And then we have sort of the more provocative, but I think very useful and necessary work of someone like Matthew Melvin Kushki, who argues that occult science is science. And you'll recognize that from what I've been talking about in terms of the necessity of treating the occult in terms of its indigenous local emic categories as equally rational. So those are people that I'm drawing on. And what I'm trying to argue here, and don't worry, we're coming to a conclusion at this point, is that even though, if what Muslims are doing in the 17th century when it comes to studying the natural science, even though if it doesn't map onto our narratives of progress today, right? Progress is this very slippery, dangerous term which evaluates intellectual development that always runs along a teleology. It has to reach to the modern, and then everything we look at in the past is evaluated according to that. How do we evaluate the effort, the time, the money that's put into studying the natural sciences, transmitting the natural sciences, writing the natural sciences during this time period, if it doesn't map onto what we consider to be real today? I would argue that at least if we think of this as, and can recognize this as a form of creative intellectual endeavor with social meaning, that it will move us out of the admittedly largely debunked myth that the rationality was brought back into the Muslim world with the Europeans in the 19th century. And again, outside the academy, that story still has a great deal of sway. But what we do here then also is by looking at the way that the natural sciences were embraced by religious scholars, we really get a sense of how perhaps this science-religion binary, which became very favorable in the late 19th century and is kind of quintessential to the European 20th century in post-Enlightenment self-understanding, is non-productive when it comes to looking at the way in which people produce knowledge at this time period. And as I said, I like Kuhn and so forth. But to do this, and I will end on this point, to really do this, we have to be able to work from the ground up. For far too long, we have taken the master narratives and imposed that upon individual works that we come from without looking closely to the whole spectrum of what is being produced. So in my world of worlds, and I admit this is kind of a Germanic research agenda because they think in multiple generations of scholars where we think in like 5 to 10 years. But in my world of worlds, I would have like a couple of thousand people, and one person would work on, say, the 13th to the 14th century, then the next person on the 14th to the 15th, and so on, for each individual region of the broad area we consider the Muslim world, and just look at the material. For Morocco alone, we have 100,000 manuscripts, many of which have not, like the vast majority of which have not been edited. We don't even know what we have. Right? We have created narratives based on an embracing of master narratives that are rooted in ignorance, and we don't know what we're working with. I don't expect that any of the material we find will rewrite our narrative and that we'll have a new Muslim Einstein or Copernicus. That's not the purpose of the narrative, of the project. The project is to re-excavate different ways of understanding the natural world within Muslim societies in the past. So I'll stop with that. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions. We do.
Thank you, Justin, for this very clear lecture. I very much liked it.
Good, thank you.
Time for questions? Sari.
Thank you so much.
It's amazing.
It's absolutely amazing. And next things I will do, I will read the book.
Yay!
That's a good finding.
Sari, I have the Arabic version too.
Wow.
No, not
That's
this
the
one.
other one. It's the other one. Don't worry, it'll come.
Actually, this is your thesis echo the debate between Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri and Muhammad Arkoun. Muhammad Arkoun criticizing Jabiri that he took only the coastal knowledge, and neglected everything is low. And it's very interesting. The debate become also nationalist. I mean, between the Arab versus Amazigh. So I think. But Muhammad Arkoun, while he doing this, I don't think he has a strong demonstration of this, but you have. And so this is why I think you push this debate further. My second comment, I have a book, it's called تجاوز القطيعة بين علوم الشرع والعلوم الاجتماعية. So I refuse to use the word العلوم الشرعية.
Okay.
Because I think every science is شرعي.
You see.
I mean, it's in the introduction. I wrote this, and I'm unaware at all of your work, but we reach
similar conclusions.
I try to break this hierarchy, specifically hierarchy that العلوم الشرعية is the ultimate goal of. So I think here we really join each other. Now, I mean, it's very interesting. You talk about a certain connection between slavery role and Sufism.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about this, because this is really very interesting.
Well, I think this is not the focus of my work, but it seems difficult to. A lot of good historical work has been done now on what happens with the notions of ethnicity, but also with the role of slavery in Morocco from the 16th to the 17th to the 18th century. And what is unambiguous is that many, both Muslim and non-Muslims with black skin were enslaved in West Africa by Moroccans, brought north over the desert, and then ended up either being forced to become military soldiers. This is the best case of this is with Moulay Ismail, the ruler, the Alawite ruler in the late 17th and the early 18th century. He creates an entire army of black soldiers, and he also makes the argument that anyone who is black is by default the descendant of a slave and therefore is enslavable, right? So this has been, Shawki al-Hamid and others have written about this. But what is striking is what is being transported across the Sahara is largely weapons and drugs. But what was being transported across the Sahara in the 17th century was largely gold, salt, and slaves. And the Azawiya, we should not think that a Sufi lodge is an organization like any other. And if slavery is permitted according to Islam, and it was practiced in Morocco into the 20th century, then what's wrong with slavery, right? So you're going to be bent. The people coming along the trade routes across the Sahara is this combination of different goods that are being sold and transmitted onwards. And we find, and al-Yusi never talks about, for example, slavery per se, but he does talk about servants. And the way that he talks about them makes me think that he's using the word possibly to refer to slaves. I don't I don't have numbers. Like, I can't do good economic history. I can't tell you, for example, that the Nasiriyya Zawiya in Tamgrut had so and so many slaves coming through it. The people who have written the histories of the Nasiriyya Zawiya have commented a great deal. And even the anthropologist Abdullah Hamoudi, who did some of his early work on the Nasiriyya and this part of Morocco, have also commented on the presence of slavery and the transmission of slaves. So I think there's nothing strange to think about Sufis benefiting from slave trade. So it was part and parcel of the economic social landscape of the time. Yeah. Yes, please.
Dr. Hassan Aboud.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. It's a new topic, and I was surprised that at the Zawiyas, natural sciences are practiced or taught.
Yes.
We know that music is taught in the Zawiyas, and it was taught from Sheikh to Murid. This is how, for instance, we Muashahat were transmitted from Andalusia to Aleppo and to Egypt, and this is why we still sing Muashahat from Andalusian times. And we know also from Andalusia, Averroes was a doctor, medical doctor.
Yes.
And he was a faqih too.
Yes.
The grandson, not the sheikh, the grandfather was also a
Yes.
great faqih.
Yeah.
So we know that was they combined these disciplines when they were scholars.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to make the link between this heritage that we know of and how it persisted. And my last question is this, for instance, a phenomena of the Maghrib of the 17th century? Did you check it out in the East, for instance, if we still have this? Thank you.
Right. Well, again, in my world of worlds, there would be this horde of postdocs and everybody out there doing all the work. It took me a decade to do this for Morocco for the 17th century. I'm assuming it would take me another 5 to 10 years to do it for any other part of the Muslim world. So I don't entirely know. What I can say, well, two things. First of all, we do know from the work of Khalid al-Raihab and others that this was an extraordinarily, the 17th and 18th centuries were much more intellectually dynamic, both in terms of production and in terms of the subjects that were being discussed at that time period, than we had previously thought. One of the striking things that I discovered is that when the French came in and colonized Morocco, they also changed the curriculum at the Qarawiyyin. And so the Qarawiyyin, before the French occupation from 1912 onwards, the natural sciences had been taught. But under the French tried to create a parallel modern school system that they would send the Moroccans through to become basically French little technocrats. And in the process, they took the natural sciences out of the Qarawiyyin to attract people to study in the French schools. After Morocco achieved, in the post-colonial period, the new post-colonial Moroccan government kept the French understanding of the curriculum. So we find then that the chief religious institutions in Morocco in the post-colonial period have adopted the same framework and the same binary between religious and rational sciences that they brought with them from the French, which is a pretty classic post-colonial moment. You revisit your own heritage through the eyes of the colonizers. I think that a lot of the messiness and the ability of scholars like Ibn Rushd, who you were talking about, to be able to function both within the realms of philosophy and astronomy and medicine and fiqh, and these things which were common in the long sort of pre-modern period, become harder to see after that. So many of the ways in which we look at Islamic history are shaped through these lenses that come out of both the colonial but also the reform movements of the 19th and the 20th century in that sense. So, yeah.
Sari?
I mean, it's also, I would like to thank you because now I understand better Abdullah Hamoudi, for instance, where he argued that the problem of understanding the tribes, I mean how tribes have been studied in the Arab world. His piece he wrote and recently translated in the journal Umran, that both Orientalists and local anthropologists did the same mistakes, that they didn't look to the to the writing in tribes, and he argued rural areas that there is a lot of writings that has been neglected. So
that's interesting. I actually don't know. I know that Abdullah, that he's published a new book about anthropology, in Arabic anthropology recently, in Arabic, which is interesting because he's struggling with his own genealogy of his own discipline. What I'm struck by with Hamoudi is he started, like his earliest articles, later he becomes famous for his a variety of works that he writes on northern Morocco and the victim and its masks, and also looking at the structure of authority within Sufism and mapping that onto the Moroccan government. But his early articles, he's really interested in the precise geographic area that I'm so fascinated with, which has to do with the sort of the Dra Valley and the areas in the south and the structure of Sufi organizations there. But yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So I think it's a very interesting continuity of your thesis, or what Abdullah Hamoudi wrote. I'm more interested in when I went to genealogy of how Islam has been studied in institutions. So I stopped in Cordially in phase, and it was interesting that we have so much evidence that France, when they colonized this area, they saw with this institution as a center of resistance, and they wanted to create an urban new elite that they can talk the same, paradigmatically the same thing. And this thesis, you find it in many historians talk about how colonialism come to erect a wall between ulum al-shara and the other sciences, and it impacted the way we thought about and then it become really a real things. What I study, faculty of Sharia, and that there is no social science for us inside. And even when they study history, they study using classical things. They don't use historiography in new one. However, there is another thesis, I think, that in some university, in some Zaytuna, Azhar, etc., is also unreformable, and you need to do something from scratch. So also there is some historian think like that. Myself, I study closely Qatar, and I didn't understand when it was this debate why they will create a new university outside of the national universities. And a very influential person, very close to Sheikh Hamoza, told me in that time that they believe that is unreformable Qatar University. So this is where you create new things. So if you like, you have two debates. What is your take on this two debates? Because here, in conclusion, you blame the colonialism that they really create erect this wall. So.
I get what I'm interested in here. I guess is it's always easy to blame the colonialists. There's a lot they should be blamed for, so that's easy. But what I'm interested in is more precisely trying to figure out how is it that we came to think that the natural sciences were not to be studied in religious institutions. Like if you go back to the middle to Maqdisi, like 60 years ago, right? In his groundbreaking and still very important work on the madrasa, the rise of the colleges. Here we have a very clear argument that Huff builds on. So if you want to know where Huff gets his idea that the natural sciences become completely marginalized in the Muslim world, it's because he read Maqdisi and never read anything that came after Maqdisi. And so that's partially his thing. He's dealing with scholarship that's been outdated for 2 to 3 centuries. Maqdisi made the right point, but he didn't go far enough in looking at what was actually being studied in madrasas outside of his own basis. It's part of the broader thing that people like myself who work on the Maghreb, we constantly blame the Mashriq, that people take a case study from one time period in the Mashriq, usually Egypt, and then project it onto the rest of the Muslim world and say, well, that's Islam. And in the Maghreb, people have a big chip on their shoulders because they're like, no, it's not. It's just what you're doing over there. So I think that this is, that's how that became thinkable. But when it helps in Morocco, when you go to the Qarawiyyin in 1960, 1970, and you say, well, where are you studying astronomy? And they're like, that's not here. We don't study that. But that is a consequence of this, contingent moment at the beginning of the 20th century when the French decide to move certain sciences out because they want to circumvent, as you were putting it, the Qarawiyyin as an alternate power base, right? So, I guess that's enough. And we have to look at what are the contingent historical and intellectual events which make it possible to think different things. And we are today so inhabit this narrative of decline and marginality and this religion-science division, but it's all the fault of the 19th century. I mean, these are all the veils that the 19th century gave us, which continue to blind us or direct our sight in different ways today.
There are very similar debates in literature,
yes.
by the way.
Yes,
It's
no, and
exact
I
same.
learned a great deal from the literature debates. I mean, what Thomas Bauer writes about poetry and about the sort of the obsolescence of poetry after the Mamluk and the Mamluk period, it's very similar to the intellectual,
And they also call for, it's an invitation also to study these local histories of
Yes,
literature.
yes. It just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time.
And we're dealing from, working with manuscripts.
Which takes
Most
a lot of
of the- most of
time.
the time.
Yes, it takes time. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it again. Thank you.
Please join me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.